All week here on Mark Rogers TV, we outlined the Auburn Tigers' improbable, some would call it an impossible run to a college football playoff berth. They've lost to LSU. They lost to Clemson. They've got 2 losses. There's a myriad of 0 loss and 1 loss teams. How could the Tigers do it? Well, they had a clear path, a very challenging and difficult path, the most difficult of any team in the country. Beat Georgia, the #1 team in the country. Beat Alabama, who would be the new #1 if they take care of business against Mississippi State, and then defeat Georgia again, who's likely to be in the top 5, again in Atlanta at the SEC championship game. That was the task facing the Auburn Tigers if they wanted to get to an SEC championship game and a college football playoff berth. Okay, they have passed the first test, pardon the cliche, with flying colors, 40-17 over Georgia. The #1 team in the country no longer. Mark Rogers TV with instant analysis. All right, the Bulldogs came out and they looked sharp on the first series, 70 yards very quickly in 5 plays. Jake Fromm up top to Javon Wims, who went over Peters, the corner, on a 3rd and long, a situation in which Auburn felt very comfortable about putting pressure on Fromm and dictating the style of play there on the 3rd and long plays. And they did that the rest of the game, but not on this particular series as Georgia looked razor sharp. Again, Fromm to Wims for a big play on 3rd and long. Then he came back to Terry Godwin, who was wide open for 26 yards. Nick Chubb with the direct snap, 1-yard touchdown plunge, and boom, 7-0 Georgia. They look like the #1 team in the country on the road against a top 10 team dominating the first series. But Nick Chubb would carry it only 10 more times for 26 yards. Sony Michel had 9 carries for 31 yards. Not much there running the football. And that was the conversation we had all week about Auburn pulling this off, was the defensive line stalemating the offensive line for Georgia and dominating those backs. Could they contain them? Well, they did more than contain them. The Auburn defensive line, led by Marlon Davidson, Dontavius Russell, also Jeff Holland coming off the end, were dominant in this game. Auburn on its first drive and its first 3 drives, they couldn't complete the drives, but they showed their multiple formations, their multiple sets, what they're capable of doing on offense. Jarrett Stidham said throughout the week that this is the biggest game he's played in his entire career at any level. And we knew that Jake Fromm, it would be interesting to see the freshman under pressure if it was a 4th quarter game, and it proved to be a 4th quarter game, and not just a game, but a situation in which he needed to mount a comeback. So Daniel Carlson hit it from 54 yards. He hit 3 field goals, and Auburn took the lead on the first 3 drives of the game at 9-7. Then they started to convert those field goal opportunities into touchdowns. Jeff Holland, we mentioned him. He came off the edge several times to put pressure on Fromm. He had his 9th sack on the season. He blew by the freshman Andrew Thomas. Fromm missed Riley Ridley, who was wide open on a post pattern. Ridley had burned Carlton Davis, who slipped on the play. And this is when we still had a 9-7 game, and Fromm just missed him. He was wide open. It would have been a walk-in touchdown for the Georgia Bulldogs. And that happened a few times. Later in the game, on a flea flicker, Auburn's defensive line saved the day. They were in the backfield. They were all over Fromm. Otherwise, Wims, or I believe it was either Wims or one of the other wide receivers was wide open on that play as well. Okay, Darius Slayton, he had to leave the field at one point early in the game. That looked troublesome. But he came back quickly, and he came back with a vengeance, and he made one of the biggest plays of the game. This, again, when it was 9-7, he ran a post on Malcolm Parrish, the senior, one of the most experienced defensive backs in the country, and Darius Slayton just made a tremendous play, shielding Parrish out of the play on the post pattern, jumping for the football, making a hands catch in traffic down near his belt line, and pulled it in for the touchdown at 16-7. All right, then Georgia started making the mistakes that would cost them this game and not even keep them in the game for 4 quarters. You had McCole Hardman muff a punt, and He did that, and this was after. Let me back up to the final drive of the first half because I thought this was telling. Hardman actually made a big play on a punt return to bring it down to the Auburn 24, 16-7 game. Brings it to the 24. There's 22 seconds left. And Georgia ran the ball once. Then they opted for the field goal. And Rodrigo Blankenship missed it from 42 yards. And they go in at halftime at 16-7. What did they have to lose? You're down 16-7. You just had a huge punt return. The place is going nuts. You're at the 24-yard line. You've got 22 seconds. You've got 3 plays. Try to score. Get a closer field goal, even if you only complete one of the passes for 5 or 10 yards. They caved it in, and they missed the field goal. Again, Auburn's defensive line controlled this game. I mentioned Hardman. I wanted to get to this play. He muffed a punt. This was huge on the day. Darrell Williams with a fumble recovery that set up Auburn at the Georgia 22. You saw Kerryon Johnson. He was a man in this game. So keep into consideration what Kerryon Johnson had to do for Auburn with Camp Headway on the sideline versus Georgia with Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, and DeAndre Swift. Kerryon Johnson lugged it 32 times against what we consider to be possibly a great defense. 167 yards. You saw the power. You saw the speed to the edge. You saw the jump cuts in limited space between the tackles. And Kerryon Johnson had himself a day. I noted here in my notes in one particular jump cut that he had on a 3rd and short to get a first down that kept the chains moving. This is when it was still, again, 16-7 and still a game. And then Jarrett Stidham scored the touchdown as he got to the corner, and it was 23-7 right there. During this span of Auburn dominance in which they took over the game, after they trailed 7-0, giving up the 70-yard drive on the first drive of the game, the Auburn defense held Georgia to 35 yards on 22 plays. Then Ryan Davis had a big punt return out to midfield. Ryan Davis also had a touchdown reception in which he made a number of nifty moves in traffic, weaved his way in for the score, game over, and Georgia was down at this point 30-7. Jake Fromm could not mount the comeback. A lot to ask a true freshman or a freshman in that point. And Auburn wins it 40-17 over Georgia. So number 1 Georgia now 9-1. They will drop. I have yet to go through the teams, and we'll have to see what happens with TCU Oklahoma tonight and how high Wisconsin should get elevated after dominating beyond the score Iowa, if you really looked at that game. So Georgia still in it. They've got games left against Kentucky next week. They'll be a heavy favorite. And then against Georgia Tech, who will mount most likely some resistance there, but Georgia should win it. So if they go 11-1, win the SEC championship, the SEC champion, it will still get to the college football playoff. No questions. However, there will not be 2 SEC teams in the college football playoff. Auburn is taking care of that. So our Alabama-Georgia matchup that has been so much discussed for the last few weeks as undefeated teams and clearly the 2 best teams in college football, that does not exist. Georgia looking at, again, Kentucky and Georgia Tech, and then the SEC championship game for Auburn. Now they have new life. They have sustained its season, and they are relevant at 8-2, and most importantly, 1 loss in the SEC. So they've got Louisiana Monroe, then the Iron Bowl at home against an Alabama team that right now is tied with Mississippi State in Starkville, 14-14. Auburn 40, Georgia 17. That shakes up the college football world because it limits the SEC to 1 spot and opens things up for the Big Ten and the Big 12 and possibly the Pac-12. Notre Dame, that's the other big moving part of all of this, and we will see the Irish against Miami in just a few minutes. Let's discuss and debate it as we always do right here on Mark Rogers TV.